A restless crowd gathers in the grand Colosseum of Rome. The air is thick with anticipation, the scent of sweat and blood lingering in the massive stone arena. The roar of spectators echoes against the walls, their voices blending into a chaotic mix of excitement and cruelty. The Roman Empire thrives on displays of power, and today, another man is about to be crushed beneath its might. Soldiers drag a prisoner forward. His robes are torn, his body bruised, but his face is steady. There is no fear in his eyes, no begging for mercy. This is John, one of the last surviving apostles of Jesus Christ, an old man who has defied the emperor's commands. He has refused to stop preaching the gospel, refused to bow to Rome, and for that, he has been sentenced to die. Before him, the executioners prepare his fate, a massive cauldron, bubbling with boiling oil. The heat ripples the air, distorting the faces of the onlookers. This is no quick death. It is meant to be a spectacle, a message to all who dare defy the empire. A soldier steps forward, tightening the ropes around John's wrists. The order is given. The executioners lift him, dragging him toward the scalding vat. The crowd leans forward, eager for the moment his body hits the surface, eager for the screams, the smell of burning flesh, the brutal justice of Rome. John is dropped. The oil swallows him. The arena goes silent. And then, he rises. Steam billows, oil splashes, and there, standing in the cauldron, completely unharmed, is John. No burns, no wounds. Just the same calm gaze, as if the boiling oil is nothing more than warm water. The silence stretches. Whispers spread like wildfire through the stands. The executioners stare, frozen in disbelief. Even the hardened Roman soldiers shift uncomfortably. Has this man been spared by the gods? Panic sets in. No explanation, no logical reason, nothing but the impossible standing before them. The emperor's orders have failed. His power is meaningless against whatever force protects this man. This is the shocking claim of early Christian tradition, that John the Apostle, the beloved disciple of Jesus, survived a brutal execution attempt that should have been instant death. And because he could not be killed, he was exiled to the island of Patmos, where he would receive one of the most mysterious and powerful visions in history, the Book of Revelation. But did this actually happen? Is this historical fact, or just a legend, passed down through centuries of Christian storytelling? What do ancient writings actually say about this event? And more importantly, if John was truly spared by God, what does that mean for our faith today? If you love uncovering biblical mysteries, forgotten history, and faith-defining moments, make sure to like this video and subscribe. We are about to dive deep into the evidence, the theology, and the significance of John's miraculous survival. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's uncover the truth. Long before he stood in the Colosseum, before the Romans tried to silence him, John was just a fisherman. A young man from Galilee, working alongside his brother James, casting nets into the sea under the hot Judean sun. His life changed forever when he heard a voice. "Follow me." That voice belonged to Jesus of Nazareth, and John did not hesitate. He left his boat, his nets, his entire livelihood, and followed the man who would one day be called the Son of God. John was no ordinary disciple. Among the 12, he was part of Jesus' inner circle, along with Peter and James. He was there at the Transfiguration, witnessing Jesus in divine glory. He leaned on Jesus' chest during the Last Supper, and as Jesus hung on the cross, it was John alone who remained by his side, standing with Mary, the mother of Christ, while the others fled. Because of this deep bond, John would come to be known as the disciple whom Jesus loved. But this love came at a cost. After Jesus' resurrection, John dedicated his life to spreading the gospel. While Peter and Paul evangelized through bold preaching and letters, John emphasized something deeper: love and truth. His writings, the Gospel of John, 3 epistles, and later, the Book of Revelation, carried messages of faith, endurance, and divine love. But the Roman Empire had no tolerance for this message. The early days of Christianity were met with hostility. Nero's reign, AD 54 to 68, marked the first great wave of persecution, with Christians blamed for the Great Fire of Rome. But by the time of Emperor Domitian, AD 81 to 96, persecution became even more ruthless. Domitian saw himself as a living god. He demanded that all people, including Christians, worship him as Lord and God. Those who refused faced imprisonment, exile, or death. For men like Peter, Paul, and countless others, this meant execution. But John was different. By the late 1st century, John had outlived nearly every other apostle. The church was growing, and John's influence was a threat to Rome. He was not just an old man writing letters. He was a living connection to Jesus Christ himself. It is said that Domitian, in an attempt to stamp out Christianity, ordered John's execution. But unlike Peter, who was crucified upside down, or Paul, who was beheaded, John's fate would be different. He would be boiled alive. The order had been given. John was seized, dragged through the streets of Rome, his fate sealed by the decree of Emperor Domitian. The message was clear. Christianity was a threat to the empire, and anyone who spread it would suffer the consequences. But this was no ordinary execution. This was a spectacle. John was not just any Christian. He was the last living apostle of Jesus Christ. His survival after all these years made him a symbol of faith, a living link to Christ himself. His presence alone inspired believers to stand firm in persecution. The emperor could not allow that. In the heart of Rome, a massive iron cauldron had been prepared, filled with boiling oil, its surface rippling with searing heat. This was meant to be a slow, painful, and very public execution, the kind that would terrify Christians into silence. The executioners moved with precision. The order had been carried out countless times before. They knew exactly what would happen. They bound John's hands and feet, tightening the ropes, making sure there was no chance of escape. The Roman crowds lived for these moments. They had seen criminals burned, flayed, torn apart by wild beasts. But this was different. This was an old man, unarmed, defenseless. And yet, he stood with the quiet strength of someone who knew his fate did not lie in the hands of an emperor. The executioners lifted John off the ground, suspending him over the churning oil. The heat was unbearable, waves of it licking at their skin even from a distance. The smell of past executions still lingered in the air. A hush fell over the arena. The moment stretched. Then he was dropped. The oil swallowed him instantly. The crowd braced for the inevitable. The screams, the agony, the smell of burning flesh. But then, nothing. No sound. No cries of pain. Instead, John stood up. The executioners staggered back in horror. The oil had no power over him. He was standing, fully visible through the rising steam, his body completely untouched by the boiling liquid. The murmurs in the crowd grew into panicked whispers. Was this man divine? Had the gods protected him? Was this sorcery, or something greater? Some say the cauldron cooled instantly, as if divine power had drained its heat. Others claim John simply walked out of the scalding vat, untouched by the fire or pain. What was supposed to be a public warning had turned into a public miracle. Roman law was clear. If an execution failed by some act of the gods, the accused could not be put to death again. And though Domitian ruled with an iron fist, he was still bound by the Roman legal system. John could not be executed, but the emperor could still get rid of him. Domitian made a new decree. John was to be exiled to a desolate island, Patmos. Patmos was not a city, not a place of comfort, but a barren, rocky prison. It was a place for criminals, political prisoners, and those the empire wished to erase from history. There were no crowds to preach to, no churches to visit, no followers to strengthen. The emperor believed that sending John to Patmos would silence him forever. But instead of silencing him, they set the stage for something even greater. Because on that island, John received the most powerful revelation in history, the Book of Revelation. And that begs the question, did this really happen? Or is it a legend, a story passed down through centuries of Christian tradition? And if it is true, what does it mean for our faith today? If John truly survived an execution that should have been instant death, then what does that tell us about God's power, His purpose, and His protection? Throughout the Bible, God has miraculously preserved His people in ways that defy human understanding. Think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, thrown into a furnace so hot that the flames killed the soldiers who tossed them in. And yet, not only did they survive, but they were seen walking inside the fire with a fourth figure, one like the Son of God. Or Daniel, sentenced to a night in the lion's den. No one had ever entered that pit and lived, but when morning came, he was still there, untouched. God had shut the mouths of the lions. These were not just stories of divine intervention, they were acts of divine declaration. Each time, God was making a statement. Earthly kings do not decide the fate of my servants. So, was John's survival in boiling oil another one of these moments? The early church certainly believed so. Tertullian, a 2nd century Christian writer, records that John was plunged into boiling oil but emerged unharmed. To them, this was no mere accident. It was an act of God's sovereign will. But what does this mean? We know that God's protection does not always come in the form of physical survival. After all, Peter was crucified upside down, Paul was beheaded, James was killed by the sword. Countless believers throughout history have faced suffering and death for their faith. So why was John different? Some believe that it was because his mission was not yet complete. John was the last living apostle, the last man who had walked with Jesus, sat at his feet, and heard his words firsthand. His survival meant that the church still had a direct witness, someone who could testify to the truth of who Christ was and what he had done. And perhaps most importantly, John still had one final revelation to receive. The Roman Empire may have tried to destroy him, but instead, they set him apart on the isolated island of Patmos. There, away from the noise of Rome, away from the distractions of the world, John would receive the greatest vision in history. One that would reveal the return of Christ, the final battle between good and evil, and the ultimate triumph of God's kingdom. If John had died in that oil, we would never have had the book of Revelation. And that leads us to an even deeper question. Does God still protect his people in miraculous ways today? Not all miracles look like surviving a fiery furnace or walking away from boiling oil. Sometimes, God's protection is spiritual rather than physical, sustaining us through trials, giving us peace when the world is in chaos, strengthening us to endure hardships that should have crushed us. We all go through moments where we feel like we are walking through fire, moments of suffering, persecution, loss, and uncertainty. But John's story teaches us something powerful. As long as God still has a purpose for you, nothing can take you out of his hands. That doesn't mean we won't suffer. It doesn't mean we won't face challenges. But it does mean that no ruler, no enemy, and no circumstance can change God's ultimate plan for our lives. John's miraculous survival wasn't just about his life. It was about the message he still had to deliver. And that message? That Jesus Christ is victorious, that the darkness will not win, that in the end, God's kingdom will reign forever. But there's still one final mystery to solve. How does John's exile to Patmos connect to the prophecies in Revelation? And what does his vision mean for us today? The attempt to kill John had failed. He had been lowered into a vat of boiling oil, expected to suffer a slow and agonizing death, but instead, he walked out, unharmed. The impossible had happened. The empire's most powerful method of execution had been rendered useless against him. Domitian had two choices: try again, or remove him from society altogether. And so, he chose exile. John was taken from the bustling city of Rome and sent to Patmos, a barren island in the Aegean Sea. Patmos was no paradise. Unlike Rome, filled with temples, markets, and grand architecture, Patmos was desolate, rocky, and isolated. It was where Rome sent criminals, political enemies, and those deemed dangerous to the empire. And yet it was here, on this remote and forgotten island, that John would receive the final revelation of Jesus Christ. What was meant to be punishment became prophecy. In the Roman world, exile was a common punishment for those who posed a political or religious threat. It was the preferred method for dealing with troublemakers who couldn't be silenced any other way. And John was a problem Rome couldn't ignore. By this time, Christianity was spreading rapidly. Churches had been established across the empire. The message of Jesus Christ had taken root in places where Roman gods were once worshipped. John, as one of the last living apostles, was a symbol of this unstoppable movement. If he couldn't be killed, then Rome would try to erase him. But what Domitian didn't know was that exiling John didn't remove his influence, it amplified it. Because on Patmos, John would receive a vision that would shape the future of Christian belief forever. Patmos may have been isolated, but it was here that John encountered Jesus Christ in a way he never had before. One day, as John worshipped, a mighty voice called out behind him. When he turned, he saw the glorified Christ, his face shining like the sun, his eyes burning like fire, his voice like the roar of many waters. Jesus had come to reveal the future. John was commanded to write down everything he saw and heard. Messages for the 7 churches, visions of the coming trials, the final battle between good and evil, and ultimately, the triumphant return of Christ. This became the book of Revelation, the final book of the Bible, filled with prophecies about the end of the world, the rise and fall of nations, and the ultimate victory of God's kingdom. Rome had tried to silence John. Instead, they set him apart to hear directly from God. And what he wrote has endured for over 2,000 years. John's exile teaches us something profound. Sometimes, what seems like a setback is actually a setup for something greater. Think about it. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before leading God's people. David was hiding in caves before becoming king. Paul wrote his most powerful letters from a prison cell. And John, exiled on a barren island, alone with God, was given the final revelation of Jesus Christ. How often do we see our own struggles as punishment, when in reality, they are preparation? John wasn't abandoned. He was being positioned. And maybe, just maybe, God is doing the same in our lives today. John's time on Patmos ended after Domitian's death, and he was eventually released and returned to Ephesus. But his vision, the book of Revelation, remains with us today. And that raises the final question: what does John's vision mean for us today? Could it be that the events he saw are unfolding in our time? Are we closer than ever to the fulfillment of his prophecy? John's story is more than just an account of survival. It is a testament to God's sovereignty, a reminder that no earthly power can silence his truth. Think about it. The Roman Empire, the most powerful force in the world at the time, tried to execute John and failed. When they couldn't kill him, they exiled him, thinking they could silence him. And yet, instead of being forgotten, John wrote the final book of the Bible, a book that would outlive Rome itself. John's life teaches us 3 powerful truths. 1, God's plans cannot be stopped. No matter how much the world may oppose him, his will always prevails. If he still has a purpose for your life, nothing, no trial, no hardship, no opposition, can take you out of his hands. 2, faithfulness comes with a cost. John suffered for his faith. He was persecuted, imprisoned, and exiled, but he never wavered. His commitment to Christ never faded, even in the face of death. Are we willing to stand for our faith, even when it costs us something? 3, isolation can be preparation. Patmos seemed like a punishment, but it was really a place of revelation. Sometimes, God takes us away from distractions so we can hear his voice more clearly. What if your current struggles are not the end, but the beginning of something greater? The visions John recorded in Revelation spoke of wars, deception, persecution, and the return of Christ. And when we look at the world today, wars increasing, division growing, faith being tested, many wonder if we are closer than ever to the fulfillment of John's prophecy. The truth is, no one knows the exact time of Christ's return, but John's message was clear. Be ready, be faithful, stand firm. The question is, are we prepared? What do you think about John's survival? Do you believe God still performs miracles like this today? How does John's story challenge your faith? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into biblical history and prophecy, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video so more people can discover the incredible truths hidden in Scripture. God's plan is still unfolding, and the story isn't over yet.